Welcome to The Digital Patient, where we discuss the latest advancements in digital patient engagement and share stories from the front lines. I'm your host, Alan Sardana, and with me as always is SeamlessMD's CEO, Dr. Joshua Liu. Today we're joined by our very special guest, Dr. Chris Longhurst. He's the Chief Clinical and Innovation Officer, Associate Dean, and Executive Director of the Jacobs Center for Health Innovation at UCSD. Chris, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's an honor to have you on the show today. You've had such an impressive career in healthcare. You're a leading voice in healthcare AI, and we're so excited to talk to you about that today. But first, I did want to point out, one thing that really shines through in all your work that I saw was just your commitment to improving patient safety, quality, and patient care. And so I'm curious, what motivated you initially to get into medicine in the first place?
Well, again, thanks for having me, Alan. And I'm glad that shines through because that's really a passion that drives me every day. And I'll say that my journey to medicine was circuitous, but like many, informed by friends, family, and life experiences. So my father is an academic physician, and I grew up making rounds with him in the cardiac ICU as a kid, actually here at UC San Diego. And I worked in his laboratory because he was a physician scientist. And after 3 years working in the lab, I decided basic science was not for me. In college, I actually volunteered at Children's Hospital because I was thinking about education and other careers working with children, and decided ultimately I wanted to be a pediatrician.
Yeah, and then somewhere along the lines, you got into digital health and informatics. I'm curious, what sparked that motivation for you?
So I actually grew up in the country. We were outside of town by about 10 miles on 50 acres, did a lot of work on the farm. And when I was in 8th grade, my father brought home a 286 PC, and it held my interest for a few months and then faded away. And then about 6 months later, a friend of mine came over and said, you have a modem in the back of this. And he jacked me into bulletin boards, and I found that there was sort of a whole new world I had access to. And so when I went to college, I actually minored in computer science and majored in biology. And during medical school, after my first year, I went to talk to my dean of student affairs. A lot of my friends from computer science were down in Silicon Valley and getting paychecks. And I asked him, maybe I should take some time off and think about if I've made the right choice. And he was a British guy, and he says, Chris, before you do anything stupid, you should go talk to these informatics people. And that really set me on this career because I ended up taking the short course in medical informatics at Stanford and finding faculty members at UC Davis, where I was a medical student at the time. Decided to take some time off during medical school to pursue a master's degree in healthcare informatics, and the rest is history.
That's amazing. And you've been bullish and well-versed in AI back before it was really a hot thing in healthcare. And you're definitely one of the leading voices today. So I want to believe that you have a pretty balanced view on things. So kind of curious now in mid-2024, what do you feel are the low-hanging, high ROI use cases for AI in healthcare versus what do you think is a little bit overhyped right now?
Great question, Dr. Liu. So first of all, I agree with you. There's always going to be hype. At the same time, I'm really bullish about the longer term. So I like to say that I think that the promise of AI in the next 2 to 3 years is probably overcommitted, but in the next 7 to 10 years, I think we're underappreciating how much this is going to change healthcare delivery. So my experience with AI actually stretches back to my master's degree in 1999. Because I wanted to be a pediatrician, I was interested in congenital heart disease and heart murmurs in children. And so I ended up doing my master's thesis trying to use phonocardiograms, so the recording of a stethoscope, to automatically diagnose Still's heart murmurs or innocent heart murmurs. And I will say after a lot of programming in Lisp, I never quite got there, but I think it's probably something that was before its time and could be done now. That being said, the tools for machine learning and artificial intelligence have obviously changed dramatically over the last several years. And so that gives us a new armory for tackling these problems. And as you mentioned at the outset, my passion's really around quality, patient safety, quality improvement. And as an intern in pediatrics, I remember going to my first delivery with a supervising resident. And after we resuscitated the baby, I was asked to write a note. And in order to write that note, I got a paper copy of Mom's chart and started copying all the labs from Mom's chart and baby's chart. And I was like, oh my gosh, there must be a better way. And so fresh out of training, I was really lucky that one of my first jobs was implementing electronic health records and trying to automate that process of moving, mom's labs to baby's charts and that sort of thing. And so all of these tools really should be used for purposes of improving the care that we deliver or improving the experience of either, delivering or receiving care. So in the next couple of years, I think we're going to see a lot of AI for administrative functions to improve efficiencies, particularly in the back office, revenue cycle space. We're seeing more AI for clinical care uses, and I think one of the most promising is the ambient documentation. So the idea that I walk into an exam room, my clinic, I consent the patient to recording the conversation to help me write a note. And then at the end of the conversation, not only does it transcribe like voice recognition software, but it actually puts it all in the right format. It's in some ways really automagical, because I can be in the middle of a physical exam, notice that your knee is swollen, Josh, and I say, hey, how did this happen? And you tell me, and the ambient documentation automatically puts that back up in the history. I also think these are the tools we're going to start using for diagnostic decision support to recommend differentials and labs and imaging studies and other things that should be ordered, even physical exam findings to look for. So I'm super excited about it, but that's where I see the next 18 to 24 months really focused.
Today's episode is brought to you by DeepScribe, AI clinical documentation that physicians and health systems love, documenting specialty and complex care with ease and precision. Josh, have you heard all the buzz around ambient AI and virtual scribes?
Definitely. Clinicians are spending hours a day on documentation, so improving their day-to-day and reducing burnout is huge right now. You and I have seen quite a few product demos for ambient this year, but I have to say, DeepScribe was one of the most impressive.
Well, Josh, you trained as a clinician. What stood out to you most about DeepScribe?
Well, using AI to transcribe and summarize the clinician-patient conversation is honestly table stakes right now. But a big challenge for CMIOs and CIOs is driving actual clinician adoption. So what really impressed me about DeepScribe is how well it can be customized to different specialties and workflows with dozens of templates as starting points. That would be critical to me as a clinician because I just don't have time to build templates from scratch.
So true. For me, I was particularly impressed by the auditable notes. You can highlight any part of a note, and then DeepScribe shows you exactly where in the transcript the note was generated from. So you can find that evidence right away. That builds trust.
Oh, exactly. Being able to confirm that something wasn't hallucinated is so important for clinician trust and safety.
Yeah, that same attention to detail that led to really high clinician adoption is also resulting with clinicians saving up to 75% of documentation time.
Wow, that's incredible. But how is DeepScribe's accuracy with specialty care or complex cases?
That's the best part. DeepScribe's proprietary LLM, Heal AI, is trained on over 3 million patient conversations. It's then further tuned by specialty and subspecialty cases, making it way more accurate than GPT-4-based solutions. Pair that accuracy with DeepScribe's customization studio to personalize the experience for different clinician preferences and workflows, and it becomes incredibly flexible.
Alan, speaking of flexibility, I could use some yoga myself. Flexibility is key when it comes to working with health systems with so many moving parts. DeepScribe sounds fantastic. Where can health systems learn more?
About your yoga? I don't think they want to. But about DeepScribe, check out deepscribe.ai. That's deepscribe.ai to learn more.
Can I ask how you think about ROI for some of these AI tools where, let's say for ambient, it may not necessarily increase productivity because clinicians don't necessarily want to see more patients. They just want to have maybe better well-being and lower cognitive load. So when you're trying to sell an ROI to the finance folks in the health system where the ROI might not be more productivity or more throughput, but maybe it's better clinician well-being, is that an easy pitch to make to finance folks with AI tools like ambient, or how do you do that?
So first of all, I'm going to defend our finance colleagues because in my experience, our CFO and other financial leaders recognize that not every project's going to have a financial ROI, and some things you do because they're the right thing to do or because there's a softer ROI. So, physicians that spend less time with after-hours documentation who are happier, deliver better patient care, and that better experience translates to less turnover, right? And so there's a cost savings associated with that, but it's hard to quantify. And so there are a lot of projects that we do, AI or not, because of the right investments to make, right? And that's the way that we refer to them, is that they're investments. At the same time, that does not preclude implementing AI in ways that do deliver a financial ROI. And that's where I think we're going to see that more in the rev cycle space, things like coding and others, where we can help our staff be more efficient, tee things up for them, so that they can be more productive with less busy work.
Well, speaking of being more productive with less busy work, you were one of the first involved with the pilot study on AI-generated patient message drafts. And I believe your original hypothesis was that using these AI-generated drafts, clinicians would maybe save time reading and responding to messages, but I don't think that was the case from your findings. So I'm curious, what did you find with that pilot?
Yeah, thanks for the great question, Alan. So I'll tell this story from the beginning, which is everybody remembers November 22 or maybe early December when you started playing with that ChatGPT tool. And I got a call from one of my colleagues here at UC San Diego, Dr. John Ayers. And John said, "Chris, have you played with this?" I said, "Yeah, it's super interesting." And he said, "Yeah, in fact, I'm feeding it patient questions off of Reddit that have been answered by doctors on Reddit. And you wouldn't believe the responses." I said, "No kidding." And then I had to go explain to my wife why I was going to spend some of the holiday break ranking 200, patient questions, responses from the chatbot and doctors. And it was a super interesting experience because we were putatively blinded to which one was which. It was super obvious because the chatbot responses were always, 3 or 4 paragraphs, and the physician responses were usually a paragraph, 3 or 4 sentences. And so as we went through, it was obvious, and the findings supported the idea that the chatbot could deliver very high quality and apparently empathetic responses, right? And so that was published in JAMA Medicine in April of 2023. But we had the results for submission, by January. And I called up our electronic health record vendor and spoke with the VP of Research and Development, Sumit, and said, "Sumit, have you played with ChatGPT? Because this is some of the results we've got." And I shared them with him. And he said, "Yeah, in fact, we're, working with Microsoft to try to integrate this very quickly. And this seems like a really great area to pilot." And so UC San Diego, Stanford, and then ultimately University of Wisconsin were announced as the first 3 pilot sites. And we helped to design the workflows. And there are some really important things we put in there. So for example, one of our AI governance principles is accountability. And so we keep a human in the loop. There's 2 buttons, one that says start with draft and one that says start blank reply. But there's no button that says just send now. So it requires a clinician review. Another really interesting principle that we live by is transparency. And a lot of times people think about that in terms of transparency of algorithms and things like that. But somebody on our governance asked a really important question. Well, should we be transparent with patients that we're using this? And some of our clinicians said, well, we use macros and templates and dot phrases and things today. Like we don't have a, disclaimer that we're using macros. But we had patient representatives, bioethicists, and others who said, AI is different, right? Like our patients and families are nervous about it. So we should be ultimately transparent because that will help to generate trust. And I think that was absolutely the right thing to do. So anytime a clinician hits that button that says start with draft, then it automatically appends something that says this message was, automatically generated and reviewed and edited by your doctor. So we got very positive feedback on that. And like a lot of things that we do when we move AI into production, we're really committed to measuring outcomes. In fact, our new Chief AI Officer, Dr. Karandeep Singh, likes to talk about the health AI paradox, which is that researched algorithms have rarely been implemented, and implemented algorithms are rarely researched. And so we're really trying to close that gap with our Jacobs Center for Health Innovation. And we dedicated some resources to measuring the impact of these AI-generated drafts. And so, as you mentioned, Alan, I was surprised to find that it didn't save time because that's what I thought it would do. But it turns out our busy primary care physicians who might get 30 messages a day, we're spending about 15 minutes after hours before the AI-generated drafts because it takes about 30 seconds to read a patient message and type a response or use a template or something like that. After we introduced the AI draft, it still took about 30 seconds because now you're reading a short patient question, but maybe a 3-paragraph response and editing it for accuracy and that sort of thing. So it was not a time saver. I think that's an important finding. That being said, there were several other benefits. Number one, it decreased cognitive burden. And in fact, in our randomized trial, that was measurable. In the Stanford study that occurred at the same time, and we worked together and cross-pollinated authorship, they actually measured physician burnout and saw a decrease in burnout. And so that's really important. We all know it's a lot easier to start with, copy and edit it than it is to start with a blank screen. And that's what we heard from our clinicians. The other interesting finding was that the messages were 2.7 times longer when they started with the AI-generated drafts. And so ostensibly, they may have been higher quality too. And so we didn't measure it in that initial study. We're doing some ongoing work, but it's really something exciting that I don't think we're going to turn off because our clinicians do like it. As we're expanding it to other specialties, the other thing that we're finding is many of our procedural specialties have nurses or mid-levels helping answer questions, and the benefit in those populations may be even larger than in the physician population as well. So lots more to come, and it's important we understand the risks and benefits, before these tools get widely deployed.
That's amazing. Can I ask you, when you think about adoption of tools like this for clinicians, like what's your bar for success? Like, for example, is it that if half our clinicians adopt this, that's great because we don't expect everyone to use it, but if it was like 1% adoption, we should just turn it off? Like, how do you think about what's good enough to kind of maintain a tool like this?
Yeah, great question, Josh. First of all, it's contextual, right? There's not one set of rules. So it really depends on what outcome you're trying to achieve and what the cost is and things like that. Secondly, as we talked about earlier, we're not going to be eliminating nurses and doctors as a result of AI. What we're trying to do is to improve the experience of both delivering and receiving care. And so we're trying to measure those outcomes. And when you think about the original, Institute of Medicine definition of quality, it included those 6 domains, right? So equity and effectiveness, timeliness, patient safety, et cetera. Those are the things that we're really looking to impact, and that includes experience or satisfaction.
So Chris, I was curious, as AI models improve and you do more research and kind of bridge that gap between application, do you foresee a future where clinicians can trust the models more heavily on, let's say, like these patient-generated message drafts and have less oversight and maybe, because of that, move a bit quicker?
Yeah, Alan, it's a really interesting question. And there are some sites now that are sharing data that suggests they might save a minute or two. So it's a little bit of time savings, but it's just not significant. I think that the real time savings is going to come from the documentation tools. We know from a lot of time and motion studies from people like Julie Adler-Milstein and Lisa Rottenstein and AJ Holmgren and others that the bulk of a physician's administrative time is spent doing documentation, at least in the United States. We can talk about other countries where that's actually less true because they write much shorter notes because they're not writing notes for compliance, medical, legal, and billing purposes. But in the US, that's where we see a lot of time spent. I think that's where the real time savings opportunity comes in, is helping improve documentation. So if we think about other types of benefits, though, we certainly want to improve care quality. And so we could talk about some of the opportunities we're exploring in that space.
One of the things that strikes me about how people think about AI versus a human clinician is that people worry about like the AI, let's say an LLM hallucinating something and giving the wrong recommendation to a patient. And that's why we need humans in the loop and having oversight. But I feel like we often forget that even humans have an error rate because maybe we have fatigue or, we haven't been trained in all the data because there's too much data in medicine to be aware of. So we don't have a 0% error rate as a human. So do you feel like there's a certain point where maybe, let's say, LLMs will have a certain error rate, but if it's like as good as a human clinician at scale, that's good enough to use at some point? Or do you feel like we're never going to get to that point anytime soon?
Josh, that's a fantastic question. So let's explore this a little bit. First of all, I'm really passionate about learning health system. And one of the tenets in a learning health system is that you should be constantly improving. And so your goal isn't perfection. Your goal is better than you were today, right? And so that concept you're talking about is clinical equipoise, right? Let's say there's 2 different drugs that, are both used for a condition, but it's unknown which one's better. This is where the importance of comparative effectiveness studies and real-time learning processes, pragmatic clinical trials, and other things, becomes important. So I think you're absolutely right. We shouldn't be comparing to some gold standard that's perfect. We should be comparing to the current standard of care. But that's sometimes difficult when we're looking at things like messaging quality, which we really haven't measured well in the past. So I know there's some great ongoing work on just that topic. Back to your question, Alan, about is there a future where, you're not going to have to edit the message, you just click send or even automate sort of the responses. it actually begs a different question, which is what is the scope of practice of medicine? And at the point when you start automating messages back that are considered medical advice, you now have a chatbot or an AI that's actually practicing medicine. So do I think that that's going to happen? I actually do. I don't think it's going to be in the next 18 or 24 months though. But we've seen that these AI systems already pass the USMLE, pass board specialty exams, etc. Now, an AI can't do a physical exam, but it can certainly process a lot of cognitive information. And in fact, you add an avatar, and you could imagine in the future, perhaps we'll license an AI agent to practice behavioral health or psychiatry or something like that. Perhaps we'll start licensing subspecialty to pediatric infectious disease consults or other, very niche or narrow and under-resourced specialties like that. But again, I think that this is more in the 7 to 10 year range than in the near term. One of the things I think that'll happen to get there is the legal precedent. At least in the United States, one of the things we're held to as practicing physicians is what's the standard of care, right? If you're meeting or exceeding the standard of care, then you're not held legally liable for things that might go wrong with patient. But if you're not meeting that standard of care, that's going to be a problem for you as a practicing clinician, right? Well, the standard of care today is not to use AI. But as more and more evidence emerges about where AI can actually improve the delivery of care, you can imagine that that standard might change to the point that practicing medicine without AI in some respects might not be the standard of care anymore. And that's when I think you're going to start seeing things change.
Today's episode is brought to you by Seamless MD, which enables health systems to digitize patient care journeys, leading to lower lengths of stay, readmissions, and costs. Josh, you used to be a doctor. Did you ever feel like patients showed up unprepared for surgery? Or maybe you felt like you were sending patients into a black hole after discharge?
All the time. We give patients paper and verbal instructions, which are so easy to forget and really hard to follow. And we have no idea what happens to them outside the hospital. So what happens? Well, because we worry about them, we keep patients in hospital longer, but that drives up length of stay and lowers throughput. Plus, after they leave, patients get readmitted for infections and all kinds of problems that we could have just caught earlier if we monitored patients.
What if I told you there was a way to give every patient a virtual companion so you could automatically engage and monitor them through a surgery, a cancer journey, or a chronic care journey, and drop the length of stay, increase throughput, and lower readmissions?
Gosh, Alan, that would be amazing.
So that is exactly what Seamless MD does. It allows health systems to engage patients on their own phone, tablet, or computer with automated reminders, education, and symptom monitoring. Basically a GPS through any healthcare journey.
That sounds fantastic, but does it actually work?
It does. Health systems have done over 40 studies and evaluations showing how they use the solution to reduce length of stay by 1 to 2 days, readmissions by up to 89%, and costs by over $1,000 per patient.
But how does that work with my EHR?
That's the best part. Seamless MD is the only solution in this space with direct integration partnerships with Epic and MyChart, Oracle Cerner, and Meditech.
Well, I am getting a colonoscopy soon, so I really need something like this. Where can my health system learn more?
Well, Josh, thanks for letting me know. Your health is very important, and endoscopy is just one out of the 50 plus out-of-the-box care plans available today on Seamless MD. Go to www.seamless.md. That's www.seamless.md to learn more.
One of the things that came to mind is, to your point, probably the next 7-10 years, at least maybe in North America, where there's more regulatory oversight, you may not get, let's call it, autonomous medical AI agents doing things, but you could imagine maybe in some developing countries where there's less regulatory oversight, where maybe there's less, physicians and clinicians available, folks might be more willing to take a chance to try these things. And I think we might see data from other countries come out first, and that we might actually be able to learn from, hey, like to your point, comparative effectiveness, maybe there are certain low-hanging use cases where the AI agents can actually work pretty well. But I think you're right that, well, how's that going to be regulated? Are you going to license, like have medical licenses for AI agents? Who takes on the risk? All these unknowns that are going to matter, particularly in the States and in Canada, that we'll see how that goes. But I think we might see some things in the developing world first, and I hope it's safe. I hope it, we people are smart about it, but I think things are going to happen.
Josh, I 100% agree with you. And the concept you're talking about is called reverse technology transfer. And we've seen it in other parts of medicine. So great example in pediatrics is that for 50 years, our reflex for dehydrated children has been to drop an IV. But in other parts of the world where IVs are more scarce, they started doing NG rehydration, so nasogastric rehydration. And it turns out it's safe with fewer side effects. And so that was an example of reverse technology transfer where there's been a big push in the United States to stop putting IVs in every kid and start doing more nasogastric rehydration because it's safer with fewer side effects, faster, easier, cheaper, et cetera. And so I think you're right. We're going to see chatbots used in ways outside the US and North America that are perhaps pushing boundaries sooner. But those are because those are low resource settings where access to education, information, knowledge, and other things might be more difficult. In fact, there was an article not too long ago about HIV education in some parts of Africa and how a chatbot could help support, people who are not necessarily licensed or educated in delivering that kind of information. So I think it is exciting in terms of what this can do across the world. But I also think, here in the US, dirty little secret is that 50% of physicians are below average.
Yeah.
Now, of course, that's not true here at UC San Diego, where all of our physicians are like Lake Wobegon. They're all above average. But diagnostic errors happen. In fact, the number one cause of medical legal lawsuits and settlements is missed and delayed diagnoses. And if you ask a room full of people, has anyone in here had a loved one, had a miss or delayed diagnosis? Usually it's about half the room. And so think about how we could improve diagnostic accuracy and bring all practicing clinicians to sort of the level of that master clinician who was so impressive in medical school, and you worried you're never going to be as good a diagnostician as the person who stands up, in front of class and does the CPC exercise and finds all the zebra diagnoses. Now, imagine that with AI as a co-pilot, you can take every mid-level provider, every primary care provider, and make them as effective as the best diagnosticians. And that's what I'm excited about.
Yeah, that's really neat.
I will say, Chris, it's not like you're just blindly bullish on the technology. You definitely have voiced your concerns in the past towards the FDA approval of algorithms without substantial impact on care. So the idea that AI models are necessary but not sufficient, and that algorithms only become useful when they're actually used in practice in clinical workflow. Otherwise, they're just kind of stuck on the shelf. So I was curious, what do you believe needs to be true about an AI model so that it's actually translating into better clinical care?
Yeah, thanks for bringing up this important issue, Alan. But first of all, we would never imagine a new drug coming to market and receiving FDA approval without efficacy data, right? I mean, imagine if I told you, hey, Alan, we got a new drug for your cancer, and it has very few side effects. And you said, well, that's great, but does it work? And I said, I don't know. We've never tried it before. But that's the equivalent of what we're doing today with software as a medical device. So, for example, the first sepsis AI algorithm was FDA approved recently. And yet there are no outcomes data about it actually impacting care. And in fact, if you look at what has to go into the algorithm, it's a bunch of labs we don't usually order. So you kind of have to have a suspicion of sepsis already in order to order the labs to inform the algorithm. So it's really hard to imagine how this is going to impact care. So I do have concerns, not because the FDA isn't doing its best to try to help this process, but they're really looking at safety, just like they do for medical devices. They're not looking at efficacy. And yet most of the world says, oh, the FDA approved this algorithm, it must work. And so there's a false jump there. And people are going to start buying things because they're FDA approved without the outcomes data that really justifies it. So that's what worries me. The question then becomes, well, how do you generate that outcomes data? And of course, that was the topic of the New England Journal AI paper we published recently that highlighted the importance of implementation science and the need for sort of centers to serve as implementation science centers to evaluate clinical effectiveness of AI models. Because there's really no way to know if a model is going to impact care without looking at the wild. In fact, the 2022 Blueprint for AI that was released by the federal government in the United States specifically called for AI algorithms to be tested in environments that as closely as possible mirror the environment in which they'll be released, and then carefully monitored after being used in production, right? For shift and drift and outcomes and things like that. There's only one way to do that, right? it has to be implemented in health delivery organizations where those outcomes can be monitored. So I'll give you an example, which is the sepsis work that Dr. Shamim Namadi and Dr. Gabe Wardy have led here at UC San Diego. Long before large language models, we recruited Shamim from Emory, and he already had 6 years of experience and $1 million of grants in sepsis AI. And I asked him when he interviewed, what are you interested about coming to UCSD? It seems like you're doing pretty well. And he says, well, Chris, I've done a bunch of research, but I've never implemented these algorithms. And I said, well, that's great, because we see an opportunity to improve sepsis care. If you come here, I'm going to pair you up with our medical director of sepsis care. And that's exactly what I did. And Shamim's a PhD data scientist, rock star. Gabe has no background in data science, or at least he didn't when we introduced them. But the two of them together are this fantastic dyad. And about 6 months after he arrived, we're building all the pipes to implement his bespoke models. And I said, Shamim, how's it going? We're getting close. He says, yeah, it's been fantastic. I've learned more in the last 6 months than the previous 6 years. So what do you mean? He says, well, now I sit on the hospital sepsis committee. I see how complicated it is. We have to look at the workflow and who's getting alerted. And what if there's missing labs? And what if the nurse gets the alert but can't order the labs without talking to the clinician and the physician's unavailable? And so I really give credit to this team, because they work through all this challenging implementation science to get standing orders and to get central notification on top of the bedside notification, and to figure out the workflow of the right time to notify, and et cetera, et cetera. And so all that work was done silently in the background before we turned it on. In 2021, we turned it on in production, and across our then 2 emergency departments, we measured it for a couple of years. And so we had 2 years of data when we published this back in January in Nature. And of course, it was a really impactful paper, because what we found was a 20% drop in relative mortality over the course of that use of the best practice alert. And that translates here at UCSD to 50 lives saved on an annual basis. So I was super excited, very, very proud of the team for all their hard work. And it demonstrates that, 50% of the secret sauce is the algorithm. And they did some really cool work ensuring that it fires early enough to inform decision-making. It's not firing, when clinicians have already thought about it. Karandeep Singh has actually done some research showing how some vendor algorithms are actually using data in the system that's indicative of clinical suspicion, right? So if you're firing kind of an alert based off of a lactate order, that clinicians already thought about sepsis when they ordered the lactate, right? So 50% of the outcomes we attribute to the algorithm, but the other 50% has to do with the workflow and how it's implemented. And so, you can't just expect to kind of buy that off-the-shelf algorithm and, have it sort of have an impact without really understanding all the workflow that needs to occur. And so that's why I'm so passionate about understanding the real-world evidence behind these algorithms. What has to be done from a workflow process redesign standpoint to help make these impact the outcomes that patients and families care about.
It kind of reminds me of one of my pet peeves around sometimes how we publish about technologies and healthcare and digital health, because you could have the same intervention, the same technology with 2 different publications, one where it works really well, one where it has no meaningful impact. And what's the difference is probably the 50%, which is the implementation in the actual clinical workflow and how it was done. And yet, I think oftentimes in the actual publication, there's very little detail about the actual implementation science and the playbook they use and whatnot. And it's almost like if we could just focus more of the information we share on how we implemented it, we probably figured out why things worked or didn't work for some of these tools. I just feel like it doesn't get enough spotlight. So I'm really glad you brought that up. I think everyone actually knows that. Like when you're actually implementing these things in the care delivery environment, you know how important people and process are. But I feel like when we often publish and educate others, we kind of just like leave all that out, but it's actually maybe the most important part of it.
Josh, you're speaking my language. I couldn't agree more. I'm in violent agreement. One of the problems, there was a recent review about AI articles, and 95% plus was about the algorithms and algorithm performance. And very few of the studies were actually about outcomes. And that's a huge gap. In fact, there was a review article that looked at COVID publications that mention AI. They found 9,000 articles. And of those 9,000 articles, guess how many had associated outcomes?
Maybe like 10%. Yeah.
4 had outcomes. 2 of those were international, 2 of them in the US. One of those two was one that we had published about outcomes associated with a chest x-ray AI algorithm. And it wasn't a great study. It was just a survey-based study. And so that shows you where those gaps are. Josh, I learned early in my career the importance of, people and process with the publication of a really seminal study in 2005 by Hahn and Carcio. And it was about an increase in mortality that occurred with implementation of computerized physician order entry at Children's Pittsburgh. Yeah, and it was very disconcerting because we were in the middle of implementing the same vendor system at Stanford Children's when this publication was released. And so we did a lot of investigation. We wrote letters to the editor. We visited other children's hospitals. In 2006, Seattle Children's published that they had no change in mortality with their implementation of the same vendor system. And ultimately, in 2010, we published data from Stanford Children's showing that our implementation was actually associated with a decrease in mortality. Now, it was all the same software system. And so that was the point that we made in that publication. That was really about the workflow and the process and the careful kind of thoughtful implementation methodology, not about the technology itself. And the same is true today with AI.
It's also true even for, the non-technology interventions. I remember the surgical safety checklists, lots of good data about how it works. And then there was this multi-center study which showed no impact on the typical outcomes like complications or mortality. But if you read the paper, you basically end up learning that adherence to the checklist was poor. So it was, okay, I think the checklist does work, but you have to follow it.
That's exactly right.
The checklist does not work, which I don't think
exactly. Yeah. Atul Gawande in the Checklist Manifesto, made it very popular. Peter Pronovost was out talking about it. But if it became a rogue thing, the surgeon wasn't even in the room, et cetera, the checklist doesn't work, and then you have wrong site surgery still. People actually have a culture of safety where they adhere to it and they treat it in a respectful, meaningful way. That's very different. Listen, if I get on an airplane, I want my pilot going through the checklist with attention and engagement, not treating it like it's, administrative friction.
It's true. Well, Chris, I feel like we're just kind of getting started. I feel like we could talk to you for another 4 hours, but being mindful of your time, we're going to flip over to the Fast 5 lightning round. So first question we have is, what is your favorite book or book you've gifted the most?
Well, I have to say, first of all, I'm a closet nerd, or maybe not closet, so I love Tolkien and fantasy and sci-fi. That being said, the book that I gift the most is actually American Academy of Pediatrics, Caring for Your Baby and Young Child from Birth to Age 5. And I gift that anytime friends have babies, because as a pediatrician, I often get calls. And so I'll inscribe in it, if your question isn't answered in here, please call me.
Wait, when are you going to create a Dr. Longhurst ChatGPT for parents?
That's great. Question 2, who is a person either dead or alive who you'd love to meet?
Abraham Lincoln. So
Nice.
Lincoln lived a fascinating life, and he would be the person I would most want to sit down with for a coffee conversation.
Yeah, definitely. Question 3 is a bit different. Would you rather have super strength, super speed, or the ability to read people's minds?
This one's contextual. So if I'm still working every day, I want to be able to read people's minds because it would make my job a whole lot easier. But if I've retired, I think super strength and super speed might be more attractive.
Yeah. Awesome. Question 4, what is something in healthcare you believe that others might find insane?
I don't know if insane is the right word, but the culture's changing. And Dr. Liu, of course, is up in Canada where they have a very different kind of healthcare delivery system. So one thing that I believe is that a single payer system would help us reduce overall waste in healthcare and deliver better population health. Now, as I said, I don't think some people would find that insane, but culturally that would be a difficult shift to make in the United States. And I'm not suggesting a single provider system like the United Kingdom, but rather more like Australia and New Zealand, where there's a single payer system and still private practices and government hospitals and others. I think the way to start towards that in the United States is actually covering all children under 18.
Yeah.
I think that's really hard to argue that we shouldn't be delivering healthcare to children. And some states like California have already done that, but it's a lot of gap coverage. And so I think we could explore whether this would save money and improve care in the United States by starting with children under 18.
Yeah, love that. Last question we have, what was the last film or TV show that you saw and what did you think of it?
Well, I don't want to introduce politics in the conversation, but we have a new Republican vice president candidate, and he wrote a famous book called Hillbilly Elegy. And I don't have time to read the book, but it turns out it was made into a movie. And so I watched the Netflix movie Hillbilly Elegy. It was actually directed by Ron Howard, starred Glenn Close and Amy Adams. And I would say it was interesting. It wasn't terrific, but it was very well acted. And so I found it educational.
Yeah, awesome. I didn't realize there was a film about that.
Yeah, I didn't know either.
It's Netflix produced.
Oh, wow.
That's awesome. We'll have to check it out. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Chris, Dr. Longhurst. Again, you can find Chris on Twitter or X at CA Longhurst. And that's a wrap for this episode of The Digital Patient, hosted by Seamless MD. You can follow us on Twitter at Seamless MD. And if you like the podcast and you want to learn more, visit www.seamless.md. Again, Dr. Longhurst, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with our audience today and spending some time with us.
Thanks so much for having me.